Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on Soul School. Blah blah. Apparently my mouth doesn't work. So we'll just start with classes in session. Thank you for joining me again tonight, my co-host Jeff Turner, which you mean the world to me. You are. Oh, my glasses are so friggin' dirty. Oh my god. Okay, so if there's any coughing, sniveling, sneezing going on here tonight, it is because of the stray cat that we are saving and finding a home for, who is in love with me. And every time I walk out the door, she comes running through the yard and jumps in my lap and nuzzles me around the face. And I'm all broken out I'm allergic to her. I've never been allergic to a cat in my entire life. So tomorrow morning, we're going to rescue her officially, take her to the vet, make sure she's not chipped. She's been here for about off and on 3 weeks now. And we have some good friends who lost their aged cat last year. And we're so heartbroken that they never went to rescue another one because it was just so hard. But we made a phone call tonight, and it looks like they'll take her. So she will live happily ever after in a place where we can visit her from time to time, in a massively big, beautiful home on 3 acres of land. It'll just be perfect for her. And so I wanted to name her, and Christine said, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Once you name them, that's it. They are yours forever. And so I said, well, I was thinking about Kitty Carlisle. And she's like, nobody knows that name. That's so old. Nobody knows who Kitty Carlisle was. I said, well, I know, and you know, and everybody our age knows. She's like, yeah, but it'll confuse anybody that's younger than 30. I'm like, well, I don't care about them. I like that name, Kitty Carlisle. So that's what I call her.
Well, in that way, it's like both ambiguous and specific, because you have Kitty in there, and then the specific of Carlisle. So if you ever decide, anyways, yeah, you can go both ways with that.
Yeah, you could. I know it. So anyway, how you been? I know it's been a crazy busy week. It has been for me too.
Yeah. Crazy busy, but hey man, that's life. I'm loving it, and I'm glad to be here tonight. I'm glad to be here with everybody. These shows are the highlight of my Friday evenings, and I cherish my Friday evenings. You know what I mean? Because I work during the week the same as everybody else, and Friday evenings are sacred to me in a lot of ways. But these have become the highlight of it. These conversations, the community. I really, really have come to look forward to and anticipate these evenings. So I'm just I'm jazzed to be here, man.
Well, a lot of people don't know this, but between you and me, we have a lot of followers, and a lot of them that we know personally. I hate that word, followers. I mean, there are friends, there are people, are paranormal people. And we walk together through this life and through this. We're all students. All of us are students in Soul School. And after the show is over every Friday night, my phone I generally get anywhere between 10 and 20 messages just from people who have my personal number, just from people who watch the show. They might not be in the chat because a lot of people find the chat rooms very distracting, and they don't want to miss a thing. So they just sit there and listen or watch, and they're riveted, and then they spontaneously erupt when the show is over. And very often I send you the letters, let you know who who finds the show uplifting, who is guided by it. The last one that I got, the woman was a teacher, a middle school teacher, a friend of mine named Kayla. And she wrote me this letter in text like that long, saying about when we were doing the thing about the environment. And she was just so touched and so moved and inspired by what we discussed that she canceled her syllabus the next day. And she pulled up all the charts and the graphs that Bill had and Rupert had and we had and all the information that we were sharing with our viewers, our friends. And she basically reinvented our show for her 30 students. And she said they were so pumped, they were so jazzed, they were so inspired that she said, don't ever think you're not touching people's lives. She said, because I've got 30 students now that are so excited about the future and what they can do to change the course of the planet and humanity, that their whole entire perspective has changed on class, and they come in ready to, let's keep going, let's keep learning, let's keep, and that's so wonderful that our little show can have that big of an impact, and it's just one classroom. And that's not the ones we don't know about. That's not the people who haven't been touched or inspired or uplifted, that go and take that message out into the world and spread it among their family and friends and their circle. So I guess we just have to keep doing what we're doing, Jeff, because whether we know it or not, I think we're on the right track.
Yeah. You never know how far the ripples will go, do you? I mean, you really don't. And I've learned that just in what I do in my own sector of the world, that I a decade plus ago just decided I was going to share my journey on social media with people, and really didn't think anything of it except that it was sort of therapeutic for me, never intending in any way, shape, or form to make anything approximating a career out of it. You know what I mean? And it was bizarre. I remember checking my podcast stats back in the day when I first started putting stuff out. It would be like 5 downloads, 10 downloads, you know what I mean? And then one day I went on and there was like 10,000 downloads within a space of like 2 weeks. And I was like, holy crap, how did that happen? And then from there, that's how I started traveling. That's how I started doing everything that I'm now presently doing. You just don't know who's listening at just the right time, who desperately needs to hear the thing that's being said. And, it's so easy to feel insignificant in the sea, the ocean that is the internet, because there's so many people doing and saying so many things. But our lives just tend to intersect with the right people at the right time. God, the universe, whatever name you want to give that thing, knows what it's doing and knows how to attract and bring the right people at the right time. And so I know that we were drawn together for this purpose and for this season. And I know that those who are meant to see and be a part will be. And so, just let me reiterate what I say a lot. I'm just grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to be a part of this.
Well, and, we have other projects in the works too, which we can't really share with anybody right now as they transpire.
Yeah.
But boy, howdy, when they're ready to announce, we'll make a big announcement, because we've got stuff cooking, and we are cooking with gas.
Yeah.
And, I just want to, I don't know what your plans are for the weekend, but since there's no football this weekend.
Tragically, as a Detroiter here. Yeah.
Sorry. So Christine and I have decided, since Easter is fast approaching, that we should probably take down the Christmas tree this weekend.
Yeah.
And I don't know what your plans are, but I do believe we're going to leave everything up on the mantle board because it's so pretty. And so we'll probably just leave that part up. It's just nice mood lighting for the room.
I agree with you. And I don't know if I'm going, like I said, the rest of my house, it's pretty much down. It is still in tubs at the bottom of the basement stairs. I've yet to push it in the crawl space because I just don't feel like doing that. But maybe I'll get around to doing that tomorrow. But out here in my little space, I'm thinking I'm going to keep it up just for a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, that does actually tie into some of what we had discussing tonight. And it is a little bit of an odd bit of trivia that actually directly relates to the taking down of Christmas decorations. So I don't know if you want to just launch into it.
Launch right into it. Launch right into I've got my ginger ale.
Yeah.
If I drink any more coffee today, you'll have to peel me off the ceiling. So now we've
I've come with a
graduated.
pot and a cup, so I'm caffeinated.
There we go. We're good. Cheers.
Cheers. So I have a panoply of candles on the piano behind me burning here, because today is in the Christian year is what is called Candlemas, like candle mass like Christ Mass, like Christmas. And it's also Groundhog Day. And oddly enough, these two events connect with one another. One might not think they do. When you think of Groundhog Day, you think of Bill Murray, which is a fantastic film, and I think I'm going to watch it before I go to bed tonight, just because. But
and dream about it over and over.
Yeah. But actually, the movie is actually laden with a lot of powerful symbolism as well. Maybe we'll hit on that. I don't know. But so Candlemas is a day that is actually the end of the Christmas cycle, right? Because Christmas begins prior to Christmas. There's the Feast of St. Nicholas. There's a bunch of other feasts leading up to it. There's Christmas, right? And the 12 days of the Feast of Christmas after Christmas itself, there's Epiphany. And there's other days in between. I don't go to like a liturgical congregation or anything like that, so I don't formally celebrate those, but I know of them, and I have my own little like mystical weird traditions I do in my own house. But I'm a weirdo. I mix a lot of stuff together and just have a lot of fun with it. But Candlemas is the end of the Christmas cycle. So actually, traditionally, today is the day that you are supposed to take down your Christmas decorations. It actually is, because it completes the cycle. And now we're entering into the kind of like Easter cycle, going towards Passover, Easter, and all that kind of stuff in that particular calendar. So today is actually the day to properly do it. In fact, there's old superstitions going back to the colonial era and back further than that, that for every bit of greenery one doesn't remove, they will encounter a goblin in the coming year. So I don't necessarily see it that way, but that's just a little bit of an interesting bit of trivia. But it does actually speak to the day that we're in, because this is a day where dark and light meet each other.
Yeah.
Because Candlemas, it's not only the end of the Christmas cycle, but it's also the halfway point between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. Actually, I think according to the Farmer's Almanac, tomorrow is the direct halfway point, but this is the midway point between the two. So we are right now in the space where, the sun ritually, ceremonially, mythically dies at the winter solstice in a way. And so we go through our series of longest nights, shortest days, darkest nights, and then the light begins to slowly return. And I'm sure people have noticed, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, that on your way home from work, it ain't as dark as it was a couple of months ago. And I've always found that just to be the most depressing thing in the world. You go in when it's dark, you come home when it's dark, and it's just like, oh, right. Well, you're starting to see the lights coming back now. And I actually noticed it this morning. It was noticeable to me. Like, it was very noticeable. It wasn't just that the light was there. There was a clarity in the air, and I noticed it. And I didn't even know today was Groundhog Day. Like, I literally did not realize it was until I looked at the calendar and I was like, oh, wow. And then my thoughts started going on this. So anyways, Candlemas is a celebration that takes place 40 days after Christmas, right? And that's because in Jewish law, there's a lot of ritualistic kind of purification laws in Judaism for men and women. And there's a bunch of different things that are thought to like ritually make someone impure. And so the proximity to birth and death that occurs in pregnancy and birth was considered to like be so intense that it made one unclean. And that's not like, that might sound bizarre to us, but that's just kind of how, ancient religious folks thought. And so after 40 days after having given birth, a woman has to go to the temple, and there's a sort of purification ritual that happens. They offer 2 turtle doves as a sacrifice, and there's a lot of different things that happen. Anyway, so this is the feast. The Feast of Candlemas is the feast of the purification of the Blessed Virgin, is one of the things it's traditionally called. Also called the Feast of the Presentation of Jesus, because he's presented at the temple. So here's what happens when they go to the temple for Mary to be ritually purified. They encounter an older man, and well, according to tradition, he was possibly ancient, a man named Simeon, who had been living in the temple, essentially waiting for the arrival of the Christ. And it's in tradition that he was told it's in scripture that he was told he wouldn't die until he saw the Christ. But in tradition, he was told this a long time ago. So he's thought to be like this possibly hundreds of years old saint that's just been hanging around the temple waiting for the coming of Messiah. So that's the tradition. And he sees Mary, and she's carrying the baby Jesus. And he says, basically, this is it. Your servant can now go in peace because I've seen it. And then there's also a woman there named Anna, who is called the prophetess, who was also in the temple waiting for the same thing. She was married, she became a widow, and then she devoted herself to the temple. So there's masculine and feminine principles present in this story. You have Simeon, who's the one who's serving this higher goal. He's waiting for the coming of the Christ. And then you have Anna, who's more service-oriented in the temple. That represents more the feminine principle. So remember the upward-facing triangle, the downward-facing triangle we talked about last week. You have both of those principles present here in the temple. And both of them, upon seeing the Christ, this is what they were waiting for. And Simeon specifically remarks and says, basically, you've called him to be a light to the Gentiles and for the glory of your people Israel. So traditionally, this is the day that is celebrated. So you can take your Christmas decorations down because it's now believed that light is entering the world in a more supernatural way. So we don't have to decorate the dark with the light anymore symbolically, because light now is growing through this encounter. So traditionally, candles would be brought to the Candlemas service, all the candles in one's house, and they would be blessed, and you'd bring them home, beeswax candles traditionally, and you'd burn them, and it was believed, it could ward off evil, a lot of superstitious stuff there, but these were the candles you would use for the coming year, and they would be blessed. And so I have all my candles lit behind me tonight in honor of this tradition, and welcoming in that spirit and that presence into my home, the light, right? So here we have this festival where darkness, and not darkness in an evil way, mind you, because Simeon, he's in darkness, but not darkness in an evil kind of way. Like we hear darkness, we think evil. It's just that he's waiting to see something he hasn't seen yet. So he's in the dark. And then he encounters the light, and the light and the dark meet, and a new season begins. And so here we are, the dark of the winter solstice, the light of the spring equinox meeting here, the midway point. A new season is beginning. In some of the traditional liturgies of this particular feast, Mary is called something like a divine seraphim. And a seraphim in scripture is an angel that the word literally means a burning one or a fiery one. Mm-hmm. These are beings that are like all aflame, that have something to do with a notion of purity somehow. And so in Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah says he has a vision of the Merkabah, the throne of God, and it's surrounded by these burning ones, these fiery ones. And one of them comes to him and puts a coal to his lips and purifies him. And so Mary is referred to as the seraphim that is carrying in her hands the coal, the light of the Christ child. And she essentially sets it to the lips of Simeon, who's been waiting for this symbolically. So it's also an interesting turn there, because she's going to be purified, but she's actually the one who's purifying. So that's kind of a little cool reversal there that takes place in the text. But that is traditionally what today is, the Feast of Candlemas, right? Candle mass, as though you were spelling Christmas. Now, this is one of the oldest, most ancient feasts in the Christian calendar. It goes back to the 4th or 5th century. We have evidence of it being celebrated, and it was an elaborate celebration that we have records of. So it was probably going on well before that. Now, events like this, as they sail through the sea of time, there's a lot of barnacles that gather on their hulls, and a lot of other traditions that sort of spring up around them. One of those traditions that sprang up around the festival of Candlemas was that of believing that the weather on the day determined how close spring was. And this began among Germanic peoples who believed that if a she bear comes out of her den after hibernation, that, if it saw its shadow, for example, if it cast a shadow, that there would be 6 more weeks, 40 days more winter. And if not, there was a spring, that spring was close. Obviously, there's problems with luring she bears out of their caves. So badgers were sort of the natural replacement for that. And when German immigrants arrived in what is now the United States, obviously there's a clustering of those in Pennsylvania area. That's why Pennsylvania Dutch, Amish, all that kind of stuff. So that's why Punxsutawney Phil and the whole celebration of Groundhog's Day is centered in Pennsylvania, because that's where these immigrants settled and where this tradition was continued. And so the idea was, they don't have badgers here, so the groundhog took its place. And so this is a creature that is a groundhog. It's submerged. It's symbolically dead and in the darkness. And it emerges. And when it emerges on Candlemas, again, it encounters either light or darkness. And how it encounters either the light or darkness determines the next season. And I hope people who are listening are hearing the symbolism that this is absolutely addled with. So it encounters either light or darkness. And it said that if it sees its shadow, so if it's a bright sunny day and it sees its shadow, it's scared back into its den, and you have 6 weeks, 40 days more of winter. If it doesn't see its shadow, it's not scared, and it's a sign that spring is close. Now, the groundhog symbolically is Simeon, that the light encounters in the temple, that Mary carrying the light of the Christ encounters. So he's encountering the light here, the groundhog, Simeon, and really he can either, depending on how he encounters it, he can either go back into death, if you will, go back into darkness, or move forward into a new season, right? Move forward into the light, into a soon coming spring. And so, traditionally, if it sees its shadow, it's scared and it hides. If it doesn't see its shadow, well, everything's cool. Now, I was thinking about this today. And how this works and how that symbolism could play out. And to me, I'm thinking, if it sees its shadow, it means it's still experiencing its shadow as something other than itself.
Right.
If it sees its shadow, it's seeing, let's just say, those, what Jung talks about, the shadow self, those darker parts of our nature that aren't necessarily evil. They're just the things you don't always, put out for guests to see, right? You kind of hide them in the crawl space. But they nevertheless affect how you live, right? So if he see, and Jung was all about integrating the shadow. Instead of pushing it down and repressing it, you have to accept that this is a part of who you are.
Accept it and embrace it as part of who you are.
Exactly. And integrate it. And then you lose that sort of fakeness of all smiles and hey, that kind of Ned Flanders idea.
All unicorns and fairy dust. It's not.
Right. Plants that are green all year are probably made of plastic, right? I mean, except for the evergreen. But I mean,
that's good. I'm stealing that.
Okay. But so I was thinking about this then, like, okay, well, what's the symbol? And I just love how these things have deep symbolism baked into it. And I doubt anyone sat down and was like, I want to communicate this deep philosophical theological truth, but how shall I do it? I'm going to use a giant rodent that lives underground and how its shadow is. I doubt they really thought about that, but the ancient mind thought different than the modern mind. And so literal truth and symbolic truth just sort of emerge mutually. They're not, it's kind of like if you're doing a needlepoint, right? You have the more, what's the word I'm looking for? The more discernible image on the front. But then if you turn it around, if you're not great at it, the same image is there. It's just a little more globular, let's say, because the threads are longer. But if you know the pattern, you can tell what's on the back, right? And so literal and metaphorical truth kind of emerge like that. They're telling one story and they're both being created at the same time. And now we moderns look at it as though they're two different things, whereas ancient people saw them as one thing. So anyways, so the symbolism here to me is that if it sees its shadow, it's experiencing its shadow as something other than it. It hasn't integrated it. It hasn't accepted it as though this is who I am. If it doesn't see its shadow, it's integrated the shadow, right? And so if it integrates the shadow, it means what? A new season is closer than you thought. Spring is closer than you thought. So another way of thinking about this too is maybe you don't have to go through this grade of soul school again if you integrate the part of your shadow that you were coming in contact with in this last season of your life. That the more you push things off, the more that you separate yourself from the qualities that were being drawn out of you in a season and try to say, no, that's not who I am. No, it is who you are. It's just that it's not all that you are. You are dark and you are light. And there has to be the balance. There has to be the coming together of those two things. That's what Candlemas, that's what this day is about. And if we take that on, if we take on the responsibility of integrating the shadow, we can actually initiate a new season in our life that would otherwise be put off for as long as we put off integrating the shadow. And then we just end up like Peter Pan, remember, who loses his shadow and is an eternal boy, never grows up, never matures, lives in Neverland, never had, so it's he didn't see a shadow because he separated from it. But the point is to not see your shadow because you become one with it in a sense. And so this is, and it's really cool because that imagery is throughout it's throughout the story of the presentation at the temple, because the temple itself in which they go, and that's the cool thing about symbolic stories. It's layer after layer after layer after layer, fractal after fractal after fractal of the same thing. Like Hokusai's Great Wave painting, the Great Wave itself is made up of miniature great waves, so stories, symbolic stories are made up of the same symbol. So the temple itself, right, is meant to be heaven and earth coming together. That's what the temple was thought of being. Mary holding the Christ child is heaven and earth coming together. You have the masculine and feminine and Anna and Simeon. It's a really cool story. And then the placement of the day is also the midway point between darkness and light. It's the point where they meet. It's the point where they merge. It's the point where they become one and fulfill and serve their purpose in our lives. And if you've got something to add, please at any time interject. I don't want to just keep yammering.
My notes on my little Post-it notepad.
Yeah. So we talked last week about the masculine and feminine principles. And I thought this might be an appropriate way of maybe introducing the idea, given that it is, in fact, Groundhog Day, Candlemas, a day that represents all of these things. And I just think it's so amazing that these sort of obscure little days are actually so packed with meaning if you actually look at it. I love it. Like, we think ancient peoples were stupid. They were brilliant. Just a lot of times they were unconsciously brilliant. Like, they didn't, I was thinking about this today, about how those symbols get packed into these things. Like, did they know all of this stuff? Were they conscious of what they were communicating? And maybe not, but in the same way, a child, if it's sitting down with a therapist and the therapist is trying to get to the root of something that's happening in the child's life, the child might not be able to just like elucidate all of that. But if you give them some crayons and a piece of paper, they might start drawing. And there's hints in the drawing at what might be going on inside. And I doubt the child's conscious of it. It's just kind of coming out in this unconscious flow. The therapist has been at that level, been at the level where they have been able to make their unconscious conscious and see what we mean when we speak in symbols in youth. And now they're at a point where they've been able to integrate both and can see what's happening. We moderns are at a place where we've deconstructed the mythological world. We became, postmodern deconstructionists. And now we're at a point where I think the world is being called back to a second naivete to bring a sense of enchantment back to the world, where we can understand the presence of spirit, the divine, everywhere in all these things symbolically. Anyways, that was for free as well. But I've just been, so we talked about the masculine and feminine last week, and I thought this was a perfect way to maybe bring it back up. And we talked specifically last week about caring for the earth, right? Caring for the earth. And, we talked about climate change and all this kind of stuff. And, having grown up in religion, people who were like environmentally conscious were often, looked down upon. They really were, even though, I would try to tell people, have you forgotten, even in the Bible itself, the story of your origin that you take literally? Adam and Eve were told to care for the earth. They were gardeners, meant to care for the planet, right? Why don't you see that? But they were often looked down upon because there was this notion that the world was going to end, that Jesus was coming back, and the world was going to end. And so what happened here didn't really matter too much because there was this higher thing we were aiming toward. And so I talked about the hexagram, the Star of David. So you have that upward pointing triangle. That's the masculine principle. It's a triangle. Don't anybody think I'm flashing the Illuminati sign here. I'm just showing you. So this is a triangle. It's pointing upward, and that represents masculine. We're not talking about sex, but mythological principles. That it's a phallic imagery. It's pointing upward, and the imagery is that the masculine principle is typically that which will push aside things down here in pursuit of something up there. And up there can be a pursuit of God. Up there can be pursuit of a career. It can be a pursuit of higher education. It can be pursuit of whatever. Anything that a person or a group thinks of as being a higher principle, the masculine typically pursues that, and then everything else is kind of left. And that's the principle that I experienced growing up in religion. Mm-hmm. But what we needed was the balance, because the Star of David is the balance of the upward pointing triangle, the blade, and the downward pointing triangle, the chalice, which is the feminine principle, which is, again, an anatomical image. But the feminine points downward, and it is typically more concerned with caring, for what's here. So goddess-based religions are typically more nature-based, patriarchal religions. And I don't use either of those terms disparagingly, but they typically point up. God is up there. Your job is to somehow get there, right? Make whatever sacrifices you have to make down here in order to appease that and get there. And so we think of these things as mutual. They don't go together. They seem very opposed to one another. But the image in that Kabbalistic symbol, which it's not just Kabbalistic, it appears prior to all of that. It's the joining of the two, right? It's the joining of those two principles. And it's saying the world really only functions properly when you have both of these working together, right? It really does. And so regardless of what a household looks like, I mean, in terms of like physical gender or whatever, those principles, if one of those gets out of whack, a household typically gets out of whack. There's usually someone, and it's not always the dad, it's not always the mom, but there is one who's usually more concerned with maintaining the home front. It's just natural. And then there is usually one who's more like, okay, pursuing a career, because we've got to pay for all of this, right? And I know we think of those as being outdated, outmoded things, but I mean, really.
But if you really look at it as they're functioning in tandem,
yes,
it's not juxtaposition, it's integration.
Exactly. And if one of those ever gets out of whack, things go awry. Because if you're ever just too concerned about what's here, you neglect what's up there and out there, and you lose this, right? Because you got to have a higher goal you pursue in order for this to continue. But at the same time, if you pursue only that, the earth, whatever it is that we're thinking of symbolically when we talk about the earth, goes to hell. So I literally know people who were convinced that the rapture was going to happen 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Who literally blew almost all of their savings.
Yeah.
Spent money in ways they would not have spent money, lived in a way they wouldn't have ordinarily lived, who are normally very frugal, but they were convinced the rapture was going to happen. And they let their finances go to hell, because they believed there was this upward thing that was more important. And so this be damned, and there was even one person I tried to talk to, and I was like, hey man, I don't agree with that kind of theology anyways. I don't believe in the rapture, but I tried telling them hey, my dad who does believe this way, who is a little bit more fundamentalist in his outlook on things, but he's very wise and very balanced in how he approaches things. He always told me growing up, yeah, Jeff, be concerned about it. Live like it's going to happen tomorrow, in the sense of be an upright man, be a moral person. Live the way you would want to live, as though you thought your dad was coming home at any moment, symbolically. But at the same time, live like it's never going to happen. Plan your future out, take care of stuff, whatever. And I tried to tell this person that, but they were so convinced of this higher thing that they let a lot of other stuff go to hell. And that's what happens when those principles get out of whack. But then if you let this one get too much too, it can get out of whack, because then, you could get so concerned. Let's take it to the environmental aspect of things. If you could very easily forget that we human beings are also the earth. You know what I mean? Because we
and
could look
part of the environment and the organic life forms on the planet, which is a living, breathing entity.
Yeah. And we are perhaps, because of the development of technology, our warring primate brains, we traded body mass for brain mass, but we're still violent warring primates at the end of the day. But that brain mass we gained in the shedding of body mass, we have come up with much bigger sticks to beat each other with. So that's our problem. But if we get so focused, so we could see human beings as being a cancerous sore on the face of Mother Earth, and then we could, well, the answer is just get rid of us, and then we could see people, because here's the problem. You can either, I sent you and Rupert a quote after last week because I thought it was so pertinent to what we had discussed, and actually I'm going to pull it up so I don't butcher it, but it's from G.K. Chesterton. And Chesterton,
I quote him a lot in my books.
Oh yeah, the ever quotable Chesterton. I don't think the man ever wrote a word that was not quotable. Let me see. Yeah, so I sent you this last week because this just seemed so pertinent. Chesterton wrote, and I believe this is in the book Heretics. It might be in Orthodoxy. Yep. He said, "The telescope makes the world smaller. Mm-hmm. It is only the microscope that makes it larger. Before too long, the world will be cloven, split in two, with a war between the telescopists and the microscopists. The first study large things and live in a small world. The second study small things and live in a large world." I mean, it's so densely packed. The idea he's saying is like, this is what the world is, we're coming to, okay? You've got the telescopists, speaking symbolically, who look out into the heavens and they see this bigger picture, right? They see how vast and huge the universe is. And then as a result of that, they live in a very small world. Because of their encounter with the vastness of the universe, they look around and what's around them looks very small. It looks disposable because of how vast it is out here. The microscopist, he says, is the one who looks at what is in front of them and realizes that it's as vast as the universe that the telescopist is looking out into. And so one studies large things and as a result lives in a small world, whereas the other studies small things, realizes how large they are, and lives in a large world. And he says the world, we're coming to a place where it's going to be a war between these two. And I think this represents the masculine and the feminine principle, right? And we never seem to be able to balance these things, right? But we have to learn to balance these things. Mm-hmm. And what better day to talk about this than on this day where the dark and the light are touching, right? And we're at a time in history right now where the dark and the light are touching. And we can either let one overpower the other and take control, right? Or we can let them merge into oneness. Mm-hmm. Which I also found interesting symbolically, that traditionally one of the things you eat on Candlemas are crepes or pancakes, which were meant to symbolize the sun disk, which I think is also, which is the circle again. So we're being called into wholeness, circular wholeness. So that's the thing. And we have to get to a point where we learn to balance these energies. We learn that they're not opposed to one another. They're not in opposition. See, Heraclitus, which I know the pre-Socratic, is the first to write about this idea called logos.
Right.
And his idea of logos was it's the ordering, structuring principle of the cosmos. It's the thing that's at the heart of reality. But he said, Homer was wrong when he wrote, "Would that war between, gods and men would cease." He's like, no, war between these opposing principles it's a vibration of violence that gives the world its stability and solidity. The Apostle John took that same word logos and he twisted it. I don't know if he twisted it, but he tweaked it a little bit to mean a relationship between different things, but not a relationship of friction. He says in the beginning was the Logos was face to face with God. And as a result, that Logos was God. It was three things, if you believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. They're not the same. It's not one thing, but they're so one with each other that they become one. And you can't speak of one without speaking of the other. And so Heraclitus's idea of logos was things that are opposed, and they're so opposed that from a distance it looks stable. Like war looks like the only constant. Violence looks like the only constant in human history. And if you back up, it looks like a sort of solid object because it's always going on. This vibration of violence. And Heraclitus says that's what's under the surface. That's the hand in the glove. The glove looks the way it looks and moves the way it moves because there's the hand in it that's shaped like it. John said, no, that's an aberration. We've twisted it there. So like in the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, the universe, the cosmos is sang into existence, and every discordant note was evil. Whenever like the wrong key was hit on the piano, let's say, that was the little blip that became evil, right? It's like an aberration. And that's a symbolic way of thinking about it. But he's saying like, no, what you're seeing out here, that's a wrong note. That's a bad chord. That's where you were a little pitchy, right? But the real logos isn't war. It's unity. It's integration. It's not two things fighting each other, but two things coming together. And I got to tell you, our world right now has never been more divided. Never been more divided. And the way we talk, the way we think, it's all aimed and geared towards dividing, right? I mean, even just the concept of right and left, it's a binary, right? And then we're told these are your choices, two. And sometimes those choices are both pretty bad, and then we're told, well, it's the lesser of two evils. And it just sucks whenever you're put in a circumstance where you're told you have to choose evil. You just have to choose the lesser of the two, right? But our whole world is divided between this thing and that thing. And so we think in terms of opposition, right? We think in terms of things that are against each other, things that are opposed to each other. It's one reason why I love the Christian idea of Trinity as a mystical concept, because it introduces a third element that reconciles the two, right? That pulls the two together. And actually, the Holy Spirit, the word in Greek, is feminine, right? You can rightly translate the word she. My friend William Paul Young, who wrote the book The Shack, if you've ever read it, he depicts the Holy Spirit in the book as a female, and he got a lot of flack for it because he also represents God the Father as an African American woman, and he got a lot of flack for that as well. But he realized, he was emphasizing that feminine principle. But that's actually correct. The Spirit is feminine, so you have the two like masculine principles, but the Spirit is the thing that binds it all together, and that's that feminine principle. And our world is so divided, and we see no way to come together. And I got to be honest with you, sometimes I don't know what the answer is, but one thing I know for sure is that at some point the telescopist has to look through a microscope, and at some point the microscopist has to look through the telescope, and we have to realize that we're both right in some way. The world is much smaller because it's larger, and also much larger because it's smaller than we think it is. Mm-hmm. And we have to learn how to join these principles. And what better day to talk about it than on today, a day where darkness and light are touching noses with each other, mm-hmm. symbolically. And we're also at a time in history where darkness and light, not good and evil necessarily, but two things that it could either be good or evil, where one wins over the other, or it could be integration, where we realize shadow and light belong together. You can't have one without the other.
I often say that, the opposite of love is not hate. Mm-hmm. The opposite of love is fear, and hatred is born of fear. So that's its real root. But as you were talking, I made some notes, and, the whole idea of us merging in oneness, and that realization of oneness that I often write about and I often lecture about, is at work here. And so I wrote down the word eclipse, and then right next to it, reaction. 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, I guarantee you the way that human beings, Homo sapiens, reacted to a full solar eclipse is different than how we react to it.
Yeah.
Because we know the science behind it now. We're just as fascinated. They didn't have the protective glasses back then. We do. We know why. But the reaction, the event is the same. Mm-hmm. The event is identical. as it has been throughout the course of history. How we react to it is different. And you know, there are people who worship it, and there are people who fall to their knees, and there are people that are like out there with their safety goggles on, or with a piece of cardboard and a hole punched in it, and you know, and we just react to it entirely differently because we have you know, the basic scientific information around it. It doesn't mean that they were less thoughtful or intelligent beings. They just weren't working with the same information that we've gotten, so we can attribute that change in reaction to that. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily even more sophisticated intellectually or anything. It just means that we're working with more information. One of my favorite films is called Lady Hawk. And if you haven't seen it, I really suggest that you watch it, because it embodies and even personifies the concept that you're talking about. And what happens is that this, at the time of at dusk, I'm not going to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but dusk plays a pivotal role when light transmutes to darkness, when that event takes place at the end of the day, at the beginning of night. And it brings into, and that's when the transformation occurs. And then it made me think about my books, House of Darkness, House of Light, which my mother titled. And the reason that she did was, she said, because it was both. It was both integrated into one experience, one thing. But, you know, that symbolism and, you know, the duality merging to bring us to a higher understanding of spirit and life and death and the afterlife, and, you know, big concepts, you know, even for our minds and how we've evolved in terms of our understanding and all the literature that we have access to, and the, you know, the concepts that we routinely wrestle with now. I think that it's important. I sent you a message earlier today about, you know, light cannot exist without the darkness. If we do not have that scrim, if we do not have that metaphorical backdrop of utter darkness, like this, you know, black screen on my sister's alternate computer right now. And yet, if a single pinpoint of light came through that black screen, I'd see it instantly. Because it would, oh, Bill, you know what, really, with the 5 minutes, didn't you order him like an atomic clock? And or was it me that was supposed to do that? Oh my God, we burned through an hour like it's, you know, 30 seconds.
I actually can't believe it.
Oh God. All right, so fine. You know what I think we should tell him? This is soul school, goddammit. And if we don't hear a bell ringing in the hallway to move from one classroom to the next, then we don't have to take the notes seriously in the private chat at all. Unless I hear the bell go off or somebody hands me a hall pass, I'm not interested. So anyway, so I think that this bears not only repeating, because of course that's the way that we learn most effectively, is through repetition. But also not to feel necessarily that the duality in which we live in this 3-day weirdo world is necessarily inherently conflicted. That they can actually hold hands, and that we can learn so much about one from the other. And so I think that next week we'll continue this, down this path and maybe take a little diversion, a little detour, and get into some other things. But I would recommend, well, obviously I would recommend everybody reads my books, but that's just me. If you really want to know what's going on with life and death in the afterlife, read House of Darkness, House of Light, but also go rent Lady Hawk. It will alter the way you think about darkness and light and love and death and eternity and beauty in a way that I can't think of any other film that has touched me on such a profound level. And interestingly, a lot of the events that happened at the farmhouse, they happened in that window. They happened at dusk when the light was just so coming through the room, and suddenly you could see an apparition that was always there.
Liminal space.
Until the light changed.
Yeah.
And then suddenly we were able to make that connection. And then as the darkness fell, the apparition disappeared. And that happened over and over and over again over the 10 years that we lived in that farmhouse. It was something about the light, the change from day to night, from night to day. Remember, I told you the major manifestations that occurred in the house happened at 5:15 a.m. And they were so major that it literally stopped the clocks.
Yeah.
So it all means something, Jeff. It all means something. It's not just liturgical. It's not just symbolism. It is us coming to terms with the existence of both the darkness and the light, and how desperately they rely on each other to make the other real.
Yeah.
And it's actually a beautiful thing. So we will we'll pick up where we left off again next Friday night. And then, certainly converge, diverge, do what we do. But I love you dearly. I thank you for coming tonight. It was inspirational for me. And with that, I will just remind everyone to be the light you seek. And so for tonight in Soul School, where the lesson always comes after the test, we wish you a fond farewell, and class dismissed.
Peace.